UBC's Career Centre. She's a graduate career educator, and she holds a PhD in English literature from McGill University and has taught writing, rhetoric, and critical analysis before. She's an accredited coach with the International Coaching Federation and is currently working towards a certificate in equity, diversity, and inclusion with UBC's extended learning. And at UBC, she works with graduate students to help them prepare for their careers after graduation, and that's what she's going to be telling us a bit more about today. So thanks so much, Danielle. Awesome. Just have you click this on.
You know what, I'm just going to hold it. I hope that's okay for sound on Zoom. If it's not okay for Zoom folks, maybe just pop something in the chat or give us a thumbs up. Yeah, thank you everyone for being here. As mentioned, my role at UBC is supporting largely master's and PhD students. As we move through today's session, probably there's going to be some things you have questions about, so I'm happy to take those questions as we go. If you want to throw up a hand, apologies, I don't know names. If you are on Zoom and you have questions, feel free to pop that in the chat and one of us should flag you down. Just because there are folks on Zoom, I will probably repeat the question if it comes from the room. So apologies for that. But yeah, I put together some slides. They will be shared afterwards. So if there's anything you want to go back to or take a closer look at, you'll be able to do that. And I had the chance to get a bit of info beforehand, but if there's something I didn't cover that you want to spend more time on, I'd rather this be useful to you and your questions. A bit about my role and some of what's available to you at UBC. So I work out of an office called the UBC Career Centre. If you haven't heard of it, that is okay. Many people haven't or aren't aware that it offers services to master's and PhD students as well, but it does. So if at any point during your studies, you feel like you'd like to talk with me or another advisor about career planning, maybe you have an interview coming up or you're applying for a job and you want someone to look over your documents, we can 100% do that. There's a link to book appointments online. We could do appointments over Zoom or in person. So just that's a good thing to know. If you're TAing and you want to let undergrads or other students know, feel free as well. There is also a UBC job board. I know folks often have questions about that. You would access that through the same website where you would book an appointment. I will say you're going to see a wide mixture of jobs. So if you log in, you're going to see everything from like camp counselor to research engineer. So it's a pretty wide range. It is intuitive. If you either search by keyword or jobs you're interested in, it will start to pull jobs that it thinks will match your profile. So it's worth spending a bit of time on there. Don't be put off if you see some jobs that initially feel maybe further away from your interests. And there are some things that got posted there. Another thing that's really good to know about, and some of you may already be accessing these, are the Pathways to Success professional development webinars. So those are available to any graduate student at UBC. They cover a whole range of topics from like staying motivated with your thesis and statistical software. And I do a series of ones on career topics. So we have job search, LinkedIn, interview, negotiation, all that good stuff coming up throughout the year. So if you want to join those, feel free to register. And if there is something that you were hoping for that is coming up later in the year, you can also access the recordings of previous sessions. One other thing, and I think folks may find this useful, you have access to LinkedIn Learning, which is an online kind of video library with all kinds of resources on all kinds of topics. If you go in through this link, it'll ask for your UBC student info, and then you can access all of it for free. So if you are looking for additional resources, it's worth checking what they have. They have a pretty good range. It is LinkedIn, so some of it is filtered, I think, through a little bit more of a corporate lens, but I've seen some pretty good stuff there, and I think you can kind of use it as a baseline for things you might be curious about. I'll also say, if after the session you have more questions about like, does this exist or where would I go, feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to kind of point you in the right direction for that. I guess, some of the questions I heard coming up were kind of around starting to think about career options, career possibilities, and job search. For master's students, that often comes up quite quickly. The master's is a short and intense program, and you're trying to do a few things simultaneously, like be a grad student and also think about what's next. So I always think about like, what are some practical, actionable things that busy people can do while they're also trying to succeed in their grad program. These are a few of my favorites. I'm happy to answer questions about any of them. But some of you may have heard the term informational interview or like coffee chat. It's kind of a fancy name for something most people do pretty organically, which is talking to someone about a possible career that you're interested in. And, you know, when you were thinking about becoming a grad student, you may have reached out to current grad students to be like, what is it like studying at UBC? What's that supervisor like? Is this a program I would want to go into? You can have versions of those conversations for possible jobs, right? If you know you're interested in working at the city of Vancouver and you know someone who works there, you could ask them if they'd be willing to talk with you about that. Or there are often those jobs where you're like, what does a program manager actually do all day? And one good way to figure that out is to ask someone who has that job title. I like this because it's fairly flexible. You can choose when and how you do it. But if there are sort of career pathways, possibilities, like job titles or places where you're like, oh, maybe I could work there, maybe that's something of interest, see if you have the opportunity to talk with someone who is in those roles. As far as the how, if you know someone or know someone who knows someone, ask if they'd introduce you. Most people are really willing to do that. And I think that's a great way to tap into faculty members, mentors, alumni from your department. But you can also reach out to people cold. I'm happy to talk about that as well, but I get that question a lot. This person seems like they have a cool career path. Can I just send them an email or message them on LinkedIn? And I think you absolutely can. Most people like to feel like they're interesting. They like to kind of offer advice and perspectives. Come on in. Yeah, so I think that's just one good option you can always consider. Another thing that I think can be really useful is looking at some job postings, right? I think we often don't pull up job postings until we're ready to apply. And then sometimes we're surprised by what we find or how they describe skills or what they're looking for. So it can be a really good exercise to just periodically, maybe you block out some time every once in a while to just skim through some job postings. You don't necessarily have to apply to them, especially if you're early in your program, but just getting a sense of like, how are they describing the role? What skills are they looking for? Does it seem like I could potentially be a fit for that role? Can be really encouraging to feel like there are jobs out there that sound like they're a potential match, or there are jobs out there that I'm at least curious about, and maybe I'm going to do some of that follow-up. Start a list of prospective employers. If you're like, that's a cool research center or that startup sounds interesting or whatever it is, just noting them down, right? So that maybe you can keep an eye. Are they posting jobs? Do I eventually cross paths or hear of someone who works there? Do I want to keep an eye on opportunities? Especially if you're early in your program, it gives you something to come back to and some possibilities to start thinking about. And then this last one, which I'll come back to a little bit later, is, you know, if it feels possible and available, you can look for opportunities to gain experience. So I know I get a lot of questions about like, do I need to be doing an internship if I want to get a job after I graduate? And, you know, it's something you can consider. Being a grad student is a more than full-time job. So I don't think it's always feasible to be pursuing other types of work, and depending on your funding and how that's attached, it may not be always an option. So I think don't feel too much pressure that that's something you have to do on top of your role as a grad student, but it's something to keep an eye out for. And there are sometimes opportunities for projects, summer work, opportunities to get involved in some capacity. Are there questions about any of that so far? Pick up on a few of those threads, but I wanted to make sure there were like a few actionable things right off the top. Yeah. I wonder. Yeah. So couple threads in that I'll pick up on. And I think what you're pointing to happens all the time. There's a company, they have a job posted. You can see that essentially identical job posting on LinkedIn versus the company website. I don't think there's any difference. All of the recruiters and HR folks I've talked to have said they go to the same place, or I click on the link and I see the two piles of resumes. So I have not heard anything to suggest that one is better than the other. Yeah, I sometimes find the actual company website a little easier to navigate because they may have kind of set up that application process to be a bit more specific to that job. So I sometimes have a slight preference for going that way. But if it's literally the same job posting in multiple places, I don't think there's anything to suggest one gives you a better chance of getting the job than the other. What I will say, and I'll pick up on this, right, is where you might improve your odds would be if you know someone in that company or have had that conversation, or there's someone who could put in a good word for you. Again, I don't think it matters where you upload your resume, but if there's someone that you can send an email to and say, hey, we had that great conversation, just so you know, I've also applied to this job, or I'm thinking about applying to the job. That's where I've seen a fairly big difference and a big payoff, but I don't think the platform of where you upload your documents seems to make a difference. But yeah. Okay. Oh yeah.
You might get to this later, so if you do, I'm curious, what if like we reviewed some job postings, we have an idea of maybe some type of employees, and we're like, oh, it might be a good idea. You're saying to maybe go do an internship with them or something along those lines. I feel like a lot of internship postings I see are more geared towards like undergrad or summers or something along those lines. Even the common for like someone in our position to reach out to some sort of company we might have seen, or sort of how does that get set up, or how can you get there where it's not just like an undergraduate or summer internship.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, I mean, again, I think a couple possible pathways. If you do see a posting for like a summer undergraduate internship and it actually sounds like it would be interesting, appropriate to your skill level, which depending on your experience, it might be, you could just apply and see what happens. Or what I would probably do, see if there's a contact associated with that posting and reach out to say, I'm at this level. Should I still apply for this internship? If they say yes, great. Or they might say, here's this other thing that might actually be a better fit. So if there's actually a posting, you could either apply, but I would see if they are able to offer you any guidance on that. If the posting isn't really a fit for your skill set, or maybe there just isn't a posting at all, that's where I would go to trying to get in contact with someone there to basically say, I really like the things you're doing. I'd be interested in working with you in the future. Are there things I could do along the way? I will say some students at the graduate level, what they hear is like, you're good. We'd be happy to hire you full-time on the other end, or, no, but I think you could definitely ask that question. Yeah. And I think that that's common with both like jobs, internship opportunities. The more specialized one's skills get, the more it just may be the case where it's not clear if you kind of fit into this job posting. So I think your strategy is usually apply anyways and see what happens, or reach out and try to get that clarity, or try to have a direct conversation to kind of understand that. And it might be some combination of all those three. And just one other thought on the applying to jobs that are maybe not quite the right fit, either a little too junior or a little too senior. I have also definitely heard of folks who applied for jobs and the company or the employer reached out and said, you're not really the right fit for this job, but we like your resume. Do you want to talk about this other thing? So I think there can be value to not just feeling like the only options are the jobs that are clearly posted. Awesome. Thank you. Those are great. I'll just kind of pick up on that piece about talking to people, because I think it's already coming up pretty strongly. It can be really normal to feel like everyone I know is either an academic or a grad student, which they might be. But I think they know people. Sometimes they have connections that aren't always visible. So it is absolutely worth asking the people you already know, or thinking a little bit outside the box, right? Maybe there's someone who is not related to the field you're interested in at all, but they may know people who are. So if you're starting to have an idea of some of what's interesting to you, I would start telling people, and you might be surprised at some of the connections and possibilities that start to come up. Depending on where you are, that could be literally like, if you see job postings that sound like this, I'd love to see them. And I think that's a common way that people are able to find different opportunities. Or it could be, you know, information, resources, advice. I think people are quite interested and happy to share that. Particularly as a student, right? A lot of people understand that, of course, you're early in your career, you're looking at these options. I sometimes say this is like the most willing people will ever be to help you. So I would take advantage of that. It does feel a little bit vulnerable, of course, to sometimes put some of these things out there. But generally speaking, if you have areas you're curious about, telling people that and seeing if there's ways that they can help you with exploring that is really useful. And the other thing I'll just touch on, it doesn't mean you have to go down that road, right? I think sometimes it feels really heavy of like, if I start asking these questions, that's it, my future is decided, I'm locked into it. You absolutely aren't. Sometimes the result of having these conversations is like, that's not what I thought it was, that's not the right fit for me. At least I know that now. So I think some of these steps are lower stakes to just see what's out there and what you might be interested in. Yeah, really practical question. And this comes up all the time. Like, when do I start actually applying for jobs? I will say, if you're talking to people in fields you're interested in, ask them that question because they're probably the best sort of experts on timelines. But generally speaking, for most types of jobs, most people want someone to start fairly soon after the hiring process. Now, start dates are absolutely negotiable. If you get an offer and you're like, that's before my thesis defense, or I want to take some time and go home and see my family before I start working, whatever it is, you can definitely negotiate your start date. But typically, most employers probably don't want to make an offer and then wait 6 to 8 months for you to be available to start. So I tend to think of it as you can start talking to people, researching employers, looking at jobs as soon as you want and as soon as that feels useful for you. Functionally, most people aren't applying super heavily until they get closer to kind of their desired start date. I'll often tell people, like, pick what your ideal start date would be. That might be right after your defense or a little bit later. 3 to 4 months back from there is often a good window to start doing some of that heavier applying. Now, that's not to say you can't apply sooner. If it's truly an amazing job that you're like, this is perfect, maybe you do want to apply and see if you can negotiate that. But generally speaking, I think if you're quite far away from being done your program and being available to work, applying to a lot of full-time jobs might not be your best strategy, because most of the time they're going to want you to start fairly soon. Yeah, and if you are kind of headed into that stage of like, I'm getting close, or I'm thinking about internships or other opportunities, really practical, I usually tell people do some combination of these things. One is, of course, looking for those job postings. So am I seeing postings either on the employer website, UBC's job portal, LinkedIn, Indeed, etc. Look for employers. So sometimes, not super often, but especially if the employer is smaller, they may post most of their postings directly on their own website. So if you know there's places you're interested in, it's worth either checking or seeing if you can set an alert to see if they're just mentioning their jobs kind of on there. And then back to the talking to people. People may know of things that are primarily internal or aren't being circulated very widely, or where it's to your benefit to know about that job before the posting goes up. Like I say, one of the reasons of doing some of that networking is ideally you have people who are like, this thing is going to be coming up. You can start to think about it and start, or I'll send it to you when it does open up. And yeah, this will be in the slides just for the questions around like, are there different job boards to look at? Yes, based on your interest and where you might want to work and other factors, there are some tools that are going to be more useful than others. Of course, if you are looking at jobs in a specific field, there may also be professional associations that post that. And if you're on like listservs for scholarly or professional groups, or even through your department, sometimes jobs will get circulated there. But generally speaking, I I don't think there's a lot of like magic secret jobs that are hidden away, and it's just that people are not finding them. If you're checking sort of 3 or 4 of the bigger job boards within your field, if you're connected to listservs, you're probably seeing most of what there is. Always happy to answer questions or chat with people if they're looking for specific things. But I think most of the time it's rare that there's like these secret jobs that you would find if you only knew where they were. If anything, that may again go back to network. If there's a job that's really not widely circulated, the way people are often finding it is because someone's telling them or encouraging them to apply. And I'll talk a little bit more about job postings, either when you get to the stage of applying or if you're using them to kind of think through. These are just some reflection questions you could engage with, but I mean, a job posting, if it's well written and pretty detailed, is quite useful to get a sense of like, what is this person actually being hired to do? What is the key problem they're being brought in to solve? What are the skills they want this person to have? Based on all that, would I like this job? Does it seem like this is going to be a good fit for me? The thing I will say, a job posting is a wish list. You do not have to meet 100% of the qualifications. And I think a lot of people sort of screen themselves out or are a little bit too conservative in applying. If the employer doesn't think you can do the job, they will make that decision. But if you think there's a reasonable chance that you can do most of the things on the job posting and learn some of the ones you don't know or you haven't had familiarity doing, that's a really reasonable case to apply. And I think that can be sometimes a little bit of a mental switch in academia, where there often is the expectation of like really high expertise. And of course, this person is an expert in the role. I think a lot of jobs are a bit more fluid. There's the expectation of onboarding and training. The employer is deciding, of my top priorities, what do I really want in a candidate? Where do I have some wiggle room? Yeah. 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 Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that. Yes, take the work experience with a huge grain of salt in terms of either end. If they're saying like 1 to 3, read that as, okay, this is a pretty junior position. 5, I would think of as like early career. But the other thing I'll say to that is your PhD, assuming it's somewhat aligned with the job, is actually a form of experience. And I don't know that people have there's no perfect algorithm to calculate the PhD equals 3.72 years of work experience. But like, if you are describing how you gained relevant skills and did relevant things, you can absolutely leverage that as a form of experience. And I almost think of it like, honestly, when I've talked to employers, what they're often thinking about is like level of professional maturity, level of autonomy, how much supervision is going to be required. So I think what I hear in that 5 years is like, someone where it's not their first rodeo, they've had some experience kind of doing things autonomously and independently. And I think someone coming to the end of a PhD checks that box quite strongly. And same thing, for a master's. So yes, the number of years of experience, I would, give it a glance, but not be constrained by that, because I think there's often huge flexibility in where that lies. And thinking about the requirements and the responsibilities, can you make a case for why you can do this job? Yeah, and if you are kind of actively job searching, a few things you can do, right? Especially if you're maybe navigating different job postings you're not as familiar with. It sounds so basic, but a huge source of confusion is that jobs that might be very similar have different titles, and jobs that might be widely different might both be called project manager. So often once we step outside of the like dentist, lawyer, teacher roles, jobs can be quite hard to navigate just based on the job title. So it's normal to have to ask or to look at the posting. But if you are finding a job that sounds interesting and you're like, oh, that's what they're calling the person who does this thing, could you use that as a search? Or going back to talking people in the field, if you have an idea of what you want to do, but you're not sure what that's called, I think that's a really ripe conversation to say, you know, here are some of the things I think I would enjoy doing, or I have the skill set to do. Who's the person in your organization who does those things, and what's their job title? And that can really help with clarifying. Especially if you're looking at the private sector, if you can find a company or an organization, are there other places who make or do similar things? They may possibly hire people with the same skill set, and then you can see if they have job openings. And also looking at the LinkedIn of people who work there, have they had previous jobs other places? Of course, people change fields, but there's a pretty good chance that some of the places that their employees have previously worked might be drawing on a similar skill set. Are there questions about those kind of like looking at job postings, figuring out how or whether to apply, things coming up around that? Mm.
I use like a LinkedIn for relocation function, but then it doesn't always happen. I don't know, I guess it doesn't change the focus of it.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a couple of sites, I can add them to the slides or email them along, that are like supposedly listing only remote jobs. I find that they're more useful in some fields than others. And yeah, there's some that are a little more tailored. I would think it's a bit about kind of understanding like what are the types of roles that, like, especially if you're looking for fully remote. I mean, hybrid, I think the posting will usually say hybrid, and then often it's the interview stage to discuss what does that mean. But if you're looking for fully 100% remote, I would start with what are the roles where that's plausible, right? There's only going to be so many where that is probably going to be possible. I would go back to, again, the networking piece. Are you finding people who have fully remote jobs, or are you finding organizations where someone's saying, oh, they work there and they're fully remote? So that's probably a more useful lead than like an overall job site. Yeah. And I suppose this would be case by case, but I suppose there's some possibility that if a job is posted as hybrid and you want to apply and see if you can negotiate it to full-time or like fully remote, it's not impossible. You could give it a try. I think it's going to be probably challenging, but I think it's something that could be considered. Or, you know, redefining what hybrid means, right? If they want hybrid to mean a week of every month, could it be a week every other month? Like, I think hybrid is a very nebulous term. And if there's some space for that, I think you'd have some opportunities at the offer stage to go through that. Yeah, I'll touch a little bit and happy to answer questions. I didn't do a deep dive on this because it's kind of its own topic, and I do have recordings and other workshops specifically on this, but I think there are some key differences how someone might adjust their documents if they're working primarily with a kind of research academic CV to more of like a resume style. I will also say people don't use those terms always perfectly to mean the same things. So rather than worrying about, are they saying CV but meaning a resume, or they say CV or resume, and which do they actually want? I would think about the job posting, what they're looking for, what are their key priorities. If it is, oh yeah, of course. Thanks. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, if the job posting is emphasizing research, which many quote unquote non-academic jobs are still research jobs, then I think your document may not change that much, right? The main thing they're interested in is your research experience. If it is a job that is moving very far outside of research, it's going to change more. And then I think it depends on what skills and qualities you are playing up. The other factor is how close is the job to what you were doing in your academic program. For some people, there's a pretty tight match, and some people are making a much wider gap. If I think about myself as an example, my academic CV studying Victorian literature had very little crossover with working in student advising, because that was a big change. But that depends on how those two speak to each other. You know, some basic functional things that I would emphasize, and again, if this is something you're doing as far as changing your documents, I'm happy to work with people on it. I think of the academic CV as longer, more detail oriented, and where you have more space for people to for you to assume that people know what you mean, right? Like if you list your publications, most of the people looking at an academic CV are going to have a sense of what that means, what that process was, the value of those. If you are applying to, I think, most types of jobs, a list of publications doesn't necessarily get broken down in the same way. So it might be more useful to describe some of those steps leading up to the publications, right? They may actually be really interested in how did you collect and analyze that data, because that's more similar to what you'd be doing in this job. So it usually doesn't mean that you're completely reimagining and reinventing it, but I think it's probably going to get more concise, more tailored to the job, a little bit shorter, and I think a little bit more precise. And I think of even the questions someone's asking when they're looking at a resume, they're trying to understand, if we hire you, can you do the stuff that's part of this job? Whereas I think a CV is more about track record of research results. Are there questions about like those stages, that the documents, the application process, what happens as one is applying? Yeah.
So, in the past, I've applied to a couple of government jobs
Mm.
in the US, not sure if it's Canada, and the resume aspect of those your databases, which I've been told is kind of algorithmic. You should iterate towards a set of keywords, and it felt very dehumanizing, and I didn't quite know how to do that well. And I felt like my resume and application of this black box. I'm wondering if you have any tips for government.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Government, I think, is its own beast. I mean, so for a lot of jobs, good news, a lot of jobs will be like, send us the PDF of a document, and you have a lot of control over creating it and telling that narrative. Government in, I think, both Canada and the US, there's a couple things. You may be applying to more of like a pool rather than a specific job. Sometimes it's kind of going into a pool of applicants from which hiring managers can draw, rather than applying specifically to this position, although that can happen too. And government, I think, in like a good intentioned attempt at objectivity, really wants things spelled out. So I think those documents are sort of somewhere between a CV and a resume, where they're often quite long, and it may be like communication skills evidenced by these 3 or 4 things. I've seen more commonly for government jobs where they're now kind of moving away from documents and more just like text boxes, and like, we want this thing, fill in the box telling us how you meet that criteria. But yes, it can often be kind of annoying and require something that is a little bit different from either a resume or a CV. I think the actual process isn't that different in terms of, I don't know that you need to game the system around what you put in the box. I think, the evidence you have. And I will say, when we had some speakers in from the federal government last year and they were talking about this, they said that they're more flexible than it seems. So if you've edited a student journal and they're asking for written communication skills, like, put that in. I think that it's kind of daunting because it will seem very rigid, but their indicators was, give us what you've got, similar to a resume, and try to put the appropriate thing in the appropriate box, even though there will always be some gray area there. Yeah.
Another question about resume. I feel like often I've heard it's just like open pages. Things like maybe 1 to 2 pages. Like, I feel like the 1 page is so hard to choose.
Yeah.
Because we're coming from TV. At least that's like what I've always known. But I understand that maybe for the employer, they prefer the 1 page. Like, how would you, like, what would this 2 page, I guess, is that a big thing to think about?
Yeah. So what I have found is that, like, there's a couple fields where I think there's a strong emphasis put on a 1-page resume. I mean, if it helps, management consulting, finance, investment banking are like the big ones where I've heard that is absolutely kind of preferred. I tend to think anything government, anything research, anything higher ed adjacent, 2 pages is totally fine. The more technical the job, I think the length is going to be helpful. So generally speaking, I find most people coming out of a grad program are 2 pages. And I've also even heard, especially picking up on that point of more senior positions, if maybe you're finishing a PhD, if you're truly the right candidate and your resume is 2 and a bit pages, I don't think anyone is looking at it and being like, well, we're not hiring them now because it wasn't exactly 2 pages. I think if someone shows up with like a 13-page CV, that might be daunting and not kind of encouraged to go through. But I think if you're setting up the document in a way that is aligned with the job posting and you're really clearly speaking to here's what you're going to care about, if that takes 2 pages or 2 and a bit pages, I don't think that that's like a really rigid rule. And I think the more specialized the position you're applying to, which most folks with grad degrees are, 2 pages is really reasonable. And if you are in a field that has strong feelings about the 1-pager, you will probably hear about that through talking to some people. There's another question at the back. Mm.
I wonder if UBC
Interesting. So 2 possibilities and happy to chat about it afterwards. If you don't mind me asking, what kind of job was it? Sorry? Was it like a research scientist? Okay, yeah. So accredited, like at the institutional level, a university can be like accredited with, I don't even know what the association is. UBC definitely is. Like it's partially, to put it totally bluntly, like, is this a legitimate school? So I think you could do some research into exactly where that checks out. I also would not expect that you'd necessarily need to provide that, especially for somewhere fairly well known. I think they could always check that if they needed to. The level of like program accreditation, right? So specific programs can also be accredited if it would give you a designated credential. So I think about something like the law school, right? If you are coming out of a law school, you need to say this is accredited and I'm legally able to practice. So depending on the job, I don't know which of those it is, but if it's the level of like, is this a legitimate recognized institution? I think should be fine. And I don't know that you would need to provide that documentation. Did it ask like you to upload something? Mm. Yeah. Okay. That's a really good question. If you want to email me afterwards, I can take a look, but yes, UBC will definitely have something somewhere. And yeah, and I think that's also a bit of a case where Canada is an international degree, but probably it's going to be easier to verify that than other cases might be. No, that's helpful. And these are sometimes the things that run into, yeah. I guess we'll touch on this other piece and then also happy to take any other questions. Ooh, if I can get the slides to move. Sorry, I'm just having, oh, there we go. There we go. Yeah, so I'll circle back to this because folks were asking about it. Again, I just want to reiterate, and I think this is where talking to people who have moved from a master's to a PhD into a job, I would ask, did you do an internship? Did you do a lot of additional stuff before moving into that job? And I suspect the answer you will hear in most cases is no, I primarily was a student. I drew on the project and the skills and the experiences I gained from my graduate degree and leveraged that into a job. Some people may have done other things, but I don't think it's a requirement. And I don't think it's the only way people do it. I would also try to think about if, you're seeing job postings or you're talking to people and they're saying, it's really great to have this skill or it's really great to have evidence you've done this thing. can you do that as part of your grad program, right? Is there a course you can take? Is there a workshop or a webinar? Can you do some online training? Can you do a side project that maybe speaks to that? I think I would always be thinking about how can I do that within my role as a student rather than adding more things to my plate, unless it's a great opportunity that you're really excited about. And I think, again, the bar between having done something is not as high as it might seem. So maybe I did go to a 2-day workshop, or I did an online course, or I did a project that involved some elements of that. That's still giving you a bit of a baseline that I think you could talk about. And if what they're looking for is a level of expertise, that might not be a fit. But if they want someone who has shown some interest in this type of work or this type of skill, being able to say, I've done it at least a bit, I think can be helpful. So if you are starting to see jobs and they're asking for types of experience, are there ways you could do something that looks and sounds like that within your role as a student? Just some things that might be worth considering. My tax offers kind of industry collaboration research projects. So depending on your research, if you and your supervisor found a partner outside of the university and you wanted to work together on a collaborative research project, there is the opportunity to get some funding to do that. Isn't, of course, the right fit for everybody, but it can be interesting. The Sustainability Scholars Program offers part-time paid work projects to graduate students. I think they are doing an application cycle now, or they do them a couple times a year. I know some students have really found that useful just as a way to gain some different skills and try something out. There are work-learn roles, which are paid part-time jobs on campus. They usually hire late summer for a September start and spring for a summer start. There's a huge range of what these roles look like and do, but they're part-time, they're designed to be flexible. A lot of them are actually looking to hire grad students, so that could be interesting. Of course, paid work is great because you get paid depending on the type of experience that you're looking for. Sometimes volunteer or kind of extracurricular roles have a different level of flexibility. So I think depending on the skills and the experience you want to gain, there could be some things that are worth looking into. If you're interested in like policy and administration, some grad students have gotten amazing experience through getting involved with the GSS or other student government. So that could be something that, again, you do, but you also leverage in your applications. If you're thinking about the not-for-profit space, I would look at, are there boards or volunteer opportunities? I know a lot of organizations are looking for those kind of track records when they hire, and to see that someone has gotten involved in those spaces. And depending on what you want to do you actually need to start building a portfolio or doing kind of projects so that you can point to that? If someone's really interested in science communication, it may be that they actually start hosting or doing podcast episodes or whatever it is to kind of have that portfolio of experience. So what you do really depends on yourself and your interests and capacity, and it probably won't look the same throughout your graduate degree. But I think if there's something that you are curious about, there's often ways to do something kind of like that, which can help to make you a stronger applicant. And I don't think it always needs to be, I need to go get a formal internship or job with this organization in order to get a job there after I graduate. That is, I think, most of what I wanted to run through, and we have a window of time for questions. So I'm sure there's things I didn't get to, and I'm not sure if there's anything in the Zoom chat. Awesome. Yeah. Yeah, good question. I mean, I think it depends a lot based on field, right? So if you're in, I don't know, marketing or search engine optimization, I think there's a higher chance that that's sort of a profile they're looking for. And also, I think just a space where there's a lot of activity happening, where you want to kind of be in the know, and that's a useful channel for sharing information. I think there are other fields, government being one that comes to mind, where like it's never a bad idea to have a profile, but I think that's carries less expectation and just may not be as useful a way to get in contact with people. So it's never a bad idea to have an up-to-date profile. And I would say if you're going to be like actively job searching, I would just do a quick that it aligns with your resume or your CV, if for no other reasons that if someone Googles after they look at your resume, there's sort of supporting evidence there. But as far as like actively posting and following a lot of people and like utilizing it, I would search for some people in your field, see, do they have up-to-date profiles? Are they posting? Is there information that's useful to you? If you find that, yes, there is, great. But if not, that might not be the best channel. And I find it varies widely by field in terms of how much people are using it. Yeah.
I think this is sort of related to what Charlotte was saying. There's a lot of people nowadays who like to have their own websites. I don't know if that's like very ethical. Is that something that employers would take a look at?
Yeah. Again, I don't think it would hurt. But in most cases, yeah, I don't think it's an expectation. I suppose it's a little bit field specific, right? So if someone's a graphic designer, it may make sense for them to have their own website where they highlight their projects. But I think there's a very good number of jobs where that's just not an expectation. Again, not that it would be bad to have it, but I think for the majority of jobs, that's not something they're necessarily looking for. And their expectation is that when you apply, you're giving them most of the information they need in your application documents. Yeah. Yeah, so a lot of international students do go the postgraduate work permit route. The International Student Advising Office can talk to you about that if that's something you're applying for. And I think just being mindful of timelines around that. But typically that is a work permit that a lot of employers are kind of familiar with, or it allows you to be able to say, yes, I can legally work under this. As far as difference in process, I mean, the two things I have heard, and of course, it's not that like Canada's one way and everywhere else is a standardized way, but the two themes I've most often heard is that, especially as new grads, it requires you to be quite proactive, whereas some folks have described it as like the employers just come to the university and kind of reach out to us, or that there's a more kind of mediated pipeline. So I would say, in most cases, with a few exceptions, as a new grad, most of the job seeking is going to be pretty proactive, and that might be the same, but I've heard a few international students comment on finding that a little bit different. And again, I'm sure this is the case other places as well, but the degree to which I think the referral or the network can be a factor. I mean, I will say I've also heard from people with roots in other places in Canada that's different in Vancouver from what they've observed in other cities. So I think this is also regional. I would sort of offer, if you're applying for jobs in Alberta, that may look different, but I have had a few people say that they sort of feel that it was interesting to them how much people emphasized kind of being known, having a word of mouth, having someone who was like, oh yeah, I've heard of that person before. I don't think that's universal for all jobs, but I think those are a couple of the themes. And one other thing, and especially for folks in this program that might be topical, a lot of government jobs, you'll see language that says priority is given to citizens and permanent residents. So from what I have seen and heard, it can be quite challenging to get a government job without being a permanent resident. I don't think it's impossible. Like, the priority given means we could hire you if there was no one else who was the right fit. But I think one of the biggest things I've encountered that's different for international students is it may be quite challenging to get a government job without permanent residency. Yeah.
I have a follow-up on the one with Mark. Do you think that there is kind of like screening, scapegoating bias happening on the part? I mean, I'm sure there are to some extent, but how much do you think that factors into employers hiring people that aren't Canadians? And then on the applicant side, is there something that you can do to like curb that somehow?
Yeah. I mean, short answer, yes, by all kinds of biases come into hiring all the time. There's been lots of studies indicating that the same resume with a name indicating gender or race got a very different reception. And then there's, the biases that someone's like, I'm only hiring people from SFU because I had a good, there's all different layers to that. As far as what you can do about it as a job seeker, I mean, I would go back to, if somewhere doesn't want to hire you, it's probably also not the place you want to work, right? I know there can be a desire to be like, oh, I'm going to get my way in there. And maybe sometimes that does work, but I would really ask the question, is that a place that is going to support you, especially early in your career, where I think there's a lot of foundational learning and mentorship happening? Is that actually a place where you want to be? I think is helpful to keep in mind. And then the other thing would be relationship building. So if it's not quite bias, I think of an example as sometimes being oh, do we really want to hire a person with a PhD because maybe they're going to be bored by this job, which isn't quite the same thing, but kind of adjacent. To me, that's something where it's if you have a conversation with them, if you're clearly interested in the work, you're excited to do that job, I do think you might be able to shift that mindset. So I think it depends on what the area of hesitation is, what that would mean, and if there's a way around it, it's probably building a relationship and getting someone to see you in a more holistic way. I saw a hand at the back.
Doesn't matter if it's maybe you're postgraduate studies are Canadian and then undergraduate from abroad. That doesn't necessarily sound much as local experience in some fields. Particularly those fields that you need to really understand how the concept here and understanding the law, but showing that I know how things work on the ground is really important. Even though I had a master's, it's very, very hard to get into the job market because I do not have the but if you're in a different kind of situation where the Canadian context is not as relevant, then that should be very comfortable. And so that's what we really heard about, trying to really focus on the networking and show that your skills are actually
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that. And I think that, that's good, good context. And I think, part of what makes job searching hard is not knowing what's going to stick. And I will say a lot of people I meet with are I applied to 3 jobs I was totally sure I was going to get, didn't hear anything, and then applied to this job that I thought was such a stretch. And now I'm on my 2nd interview. So it's not that there's no logic to it, but I think especially maybe if we're more analytical academic types, it can be very strange to feel sometimes it's more random than it should be, or than it seems like it would be. I think that's it for time, and I'm sure people have busy days, so I might wrap up there. But the slides are going to be available to you, and I will also, actually the next slide has my email and my contact on it. If you have questions, please feel free to reach out or book an advising appointment. I'm really happy to stay in touch, and thank you for the great discussion today.